Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on your time zone. My name is Mateus Garcia, and I would like to thank you for joining us today during Climate Law and Governance Day for this experts panel titled Connecting Trade and Investment and Climate Through NDC Updates and Future of Trade Foresight, which is being hosted by the Center for European Legal Studies at the University of Cambridge, Hughes Hall's Center for Climate Engagement, also at Cambridge, the Commonwealth Secretariat, the European Climate Foundation, the Sustainable Trade and Investment Law Initiative, STILI, at the CISDL, and of course, DLA Piper. I'd like to hand it over to Markus Gehring, who is chairing the session. Professor Markus Gehring is an associate professor of law, former director of the Center for European Legal Studies, fellow and director of studies in law at Hughes, and a fellow of the Lauterbach Center for International Law as a distinguished legal scholar. Professor Markus Gehring has been a visiting professor in several law faculties around the world and held a Jean Monnet Research Chair ad personam in Sustainable Development Law at the University of Ottawa Law Faculty in Canada. He currently serves as a lead counsel for sustainable trade, investment, and finance law with the Center of International Sustainable Development Law, the CISDL, based in McGill University. Professor Markus Gehring, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Mateus, and we should thank you as well for bringing us all together. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to our panel on connecting trade, investment, and climate through different measures such as the NDC update, but also the future of trade foresight and investment law more generally. I think some of the leading questions that we need to ask is, what are the intersections between trade, investment, and corporate governance and the global efforts that we're undertaking? How can sustainable development provisions in trade and investment agreements align with the nationally determined contributions? And have we all internalized that without any global trade, we will never reach net zero in the world? We might reach it in individual countries, but not globally. And I think that insight is particularly pertinent for today's discussions. I'm here in Baku at COP29, and so is our very first speaker. Professor Alessandra Lemon is the president of the Brazilian Bar Environmental Law Commission of Rio Grande do Sul chapter. She's a member of the Brazilian Bar Federal Climate Change Commission and a law professor teaching environmental ESG and climate law in the PhD and LLM programs. Alessandra, you have the floor.
Markus, thank you very much for your very kind introduction. Good afternoon from Baku. So I wanted to thank you again. Thank you very much for having me. And I also wanted to congratulate the chair and organizers for this extremely timely discussion. CLGD is a highlight of each and every COP for legal professionals. So it's a joy to be back to participate in these years CLGD. I wanted to start by saying that climate change has become a key element of trade negotiations. And I also wanted to highlight that we have been witnessing a significant rise in unilateral climate change measures with cross-border effects on global value chains. Most of them, of course, stemming from the European Union. So we have recent developments with a more direct impact on trade, such as those regarding anti-deforestation, due diligence, and to some extent greenwashing and carbon border adjustments, and other developments that also impact global value chains in different manners, such as those regarding sustainable taxonomies, environmental crime, and antitrust. So besides those developments, we are now witnessing a convergence of sustainability and climate reporting standards, which also goes to the corporate responsibility theme of this session, which are both mandatory, such as the CISDL, which has extremely important repercussions deriving from the fact that it mandates companies to develop climate transition plans that are aligned with 1.5 degree. Also others such as the CSRD and ESRS, and also voluntary climate reporting standards such as IFRS, ISSB S1 and S2, which, by the way, Brazil was the first country to enact into law and make them mandatory for public companies. So these are developments that are also affecting actors along global value chains. And of all these regulations, I think perhaps one that features most prominently the climate trade link is, of course, the EUDR. So, and I say this because, of course, liberalization of trade, although in itself desirable, may also have significant side effects with regard to trade-driven deforestation by driving agricultural extensification. So there's a myriad of things that we could discuss that are pertinent to today's theme, but I would like to take this opportunity to address an important development in this front regarding the EUDR, because just yesterday, the European Parliament adopted a request for a delay of 1 year of the EUDR. But it also adopted an important amendment, which may have important repercussions considering the current geopolitical climate, which is the inclusion of a no-risk country category for which no due diligence would be required. And then authorities would need to audit 0.1% of imports from these countries. So to fall into the no-risk category, and this is why I say this is important for the climate change regime, a country would need to meet 3 criteria. So 1, forest area development that remains stable or increased compared to 1990. 2, enforce and monitor domestic regulations on preventing deforestation and forest conservation. And 3, and perhaps the most important development to the climate change regime as a whole, this country would need to be a party to the Paris Agreements and international conventions on human rights and preventing deforestation. So the next step in the legislative process is going back to for negotiations with the EU Council. But in practice, it will impose heavier obligations to countries that are not a party to the Paris Agreement and potentially exempt EU countries from due diligence requirements. So this is something that legal professionals and corporations alike will want to keep track of, as it has the potential to impact both the private sector and the climate change and trade multilateral processes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lemon. And yeah, I should have perhaps highlighted to our audience that trade law and investment law is full of wonderful acronyms. So the anti-deforestation regulation that we just heard about is a highly discussed new European measure that follows on from the previous forest regulation that we had. Thank you very much, Alessandra. And we go straight to Brendan Vickers. Brendan is advisor and head of section in the international trade policy section of the Commonwealth Secretariat, and a leading light in trade policy and trade negotiations. Brendan, you have shaped these for many years, so we are very keen to hear how you see the climate trade nexus.
Thank you, Professor Gehring, and greetings to everyone. I'm actually not in Baku, but in a small town called Bela Bela in a rural province in South Africa, and the local translation of Bela Bela actually means boiling, boiling. So while that's a reminder of climate change, it actually refers to the local hot springs in the area. Just a few words about the Commonwealth for those that are not familiar with our organization. We're an association of 56 member countries, which includes some of the world's largest and smallest and richest and poorest nations. But what we have in common is that most of our members are extremely vulnerable to the effects of climate change and natural disasters. And this is particularly the case for our 25 small island developing states. So we have various initiatives and plans in place, like our Commonwealth Blue Charter, our Ocean Declaration, our Living Lands Charter, our Connectivity Agenda on Trade and Investment, and our Climate Finance Access Hub to assist our member countries. So just to emphasize what Professor Gehring said, we will need more trade in a sustainable manner to tackle the climate crisis, and we will need to strengthen the dialogue and the mutual supportiveness between trade and climate action, and how we design and implement our NDCs can play a pivotal role in connecting these areas in a very pragmatic and synergistic way. The challenge is that when we review the NDCs, we find that few explicitly mention trade or trade policy, and most measures are aimed at broader mitigation and economic diversification objectives and only indirectly linked to trade. And where these NDCs actually do directly link to trade, they're mainly focused on technical regulations. So what we take from this is that better integrating trade measures into NDCs can be a useful first step, but on its own, it won't deepen the interaction between trade and NDCs. And this is where the international dimension really can come in. And commitments enshrined in bilateral and regional trade agreements could complement the trade climate nexus by guiding countries in designing and implementing these new NDC measures. So we're very grateful to Professor Gehring and the CISDL, who's been working with the Commonwealth Secretariat to undertake a study on fulfilling climate change pledges by leveraging trade and investment agreements. And I wanted to just share 3 big ideas or recommendations from this research for further discussion. So the first is that countries could really benefit from explicitly mentioning trade in their NDCs. They could take an even extra step and mention which mechanisms of specific trade instruments could be used. By systematically integrating trade into NDCs, we can help improve communication between the government departments responsible for trade and climate change, and we can make a direct reference to provisions in FDAs, which could lead to greater monitoring of the process of fulfilling the NDCs. The second is that countries can more explicitly link trade with their national adaptation plans to build resilience and drive economic diversification to reduce their reliance on climate-sensitive sectors. So, for example, trade agreements often include provisions that encourage foreign direct investment. By directing FDI towards climate-resilient infrastructure like flood-resistant roads, storm-proof buildings, renewable energy installations, countries can leverage trade agreements to finance their adaptation goals, which is a big challenge in today's world. And the third recommendation from the study is that countries could explicitly mention NDCs in their bilateral and regional trade agreements, as the EU-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement does. More generally, this could take the form of an article on trade and nationally determined contributions. At the same time, we've seen that trade agreements also provide tools to enhance climate actions. For example, they provide capacity building. They can mobilize investment and climate finance. They can share technology, provide access to data, and establish other cooperation mechanisms. Parties could also work to include carve-outs from certain obligations to support the fulfillment of their NDCs. For instance, subsidies for renewable energy and environmental goods aligned with NDC goals could receive special treatment. There's also scope for flexibility around technology transfer and intellectual property, and this could all be granted for sectors that are tied to sustainability objectives in NDC. So to sum up, these approaches demonstrate a long-term commitment to climate action, provide legal certainty, and initiate an ongoing transformation towards the green economy. Thank you, Markus, for the invitation, and I look forward to the further conversation.
Thank you very much, Brendan, and yes, we look forward to a continued conversation on exactly these topics. We're now shifting gears ever so slightly, and one of the foremost experts on international investment law is with us today. Professor Janssen Kalamita is a principal research fellow at the Center for International Law at the Faculty of Law at National University of Singapore, NUS. He's head of the center's program on investment law and policy, and has been leading a research study on the linkages between climate change and investment law. Janssen, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Markus, and welcome to everyone. Greetings from Singapore. The focus of my brief remarks will be on aligning investment protection treaties with climate change goals. So allow me just to briefly share my slides here, and I believe you see them. As is well known, the battle against climate change requires immense amounts of investment, much of which will be private. And it also requires an immense amount of regulatory adjustment as we attempt to move from carbon-intensive industries and fuels to greener ones. And that raises the question as to whether and how investment protection treaties can be aligned to achieve these goals. It's an issue that states have themselves taken notice of in a 2023 survey of the OECD member states. More than 80% identified aligning investment treaties with the Paris Agreement as important. And this is a critical issue because states continue to use investment protection treaties as a principal policy tool for attracting foreign direct investment. But when states were asked, well, what are the obstacles to aligning your investment protection treaties with the Paris Agreement? The principal reason that was identified was that it's hard to know how to do so. And this can be looked at in two ways, because investment treaties can be seen as playing two roles in the discussion about climate change. From the state perspective, there's first the offensive question. How can we use these investment protection treaties to better attract renewable investments in particular, rather than any investments as they are currently framed? Then the second is the defensive question. How do we ensure that these treaties don't discourage states from pursuing legitimate climate change policies out of concerns that they may face claims or they may be made to pay large compensatory awards? Now, in these brief remarks, I focus on the latter, the defensive question. And that brings us to the question, well, why is it hard to know? And when states were asked, do the interpretations of investor-state arbitral tribunals provide clear parameters on policy space for climate measures? Again, a majority disagreed with that issue, with that question. And why would states find that these ISDS interpretations don't provide clear parameters? I think the answer is found in both the drafting of the investment treaties themselves, that states are responsible for, but also in the approach of arbitral decision makers. And it's a tough nut to crack. We could take one example, which is the general exceptions clause frequently found in investment treaties modeled on Article 20 of the GATT. Nothing in this agreement shall be construed to prevent a party from adopting or enforcing measures necessary to protect human, animal, or plant life, including environmental measures. Now, this might be seen as a way of ensuring that states have the regulatory freedom to adopt measures to address climate change. But the interpretation that we've found so far in the two cases that have addressed this particular text is far from reassuring from the state's perspective. The Eco-Oro Mining versus Colombia case in point, where the tribunal found that even if the measure fell within the scope of the general exceptions clause, based upon the wording that nothing in this agreement shall be construed to prevent a party, that didn't alleviate the state's obligation to pay compensation for the measure. Now, that remarkable conclusion was reached even in the face of both contracting parties to the treaty, Canada and Colombia, making submissions to the tribunal agreeing that if the general exceptions clause applied, there should be no obligation to pay compensation. So the question that arises is, well, what are the options? If the texts that states haven't used so far aren't working, how do they proceed? And the problem is, of course, that time is late. It's 10 minutes to midnight if not already passed. New phrasing is being adopted in different treaties in different parts of the world, and new phrasing is being explored in the OECD, for example. But again, time is short, and amending treaties requires time, and it's time that states don't have. So I leave with the suggestion that as much as states need to prepare for the future by redrafting and correcting their treaties, they also, arbitral tribunals, need to take responsibility for their decision-making in these matters as well. Thank you very much, Markus.
Thank you so much. And we heard earlier, of course, from Philippe Sands that in his experience as an arbitrator, it's also a question of education and educating those serving on arbitral tribunals to take these issues much more seriously. I would like to, again, shift a little bit from the international level to the more domestic comparative level and invite my direct colleague in Hughes Hall, Nick Scott, to have the floor. Nick is a manager of the Law for Climate Action program in the Center for Climate Engagement at Hughes Hall in the University of Cambridge. Nick, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Markus. Yeah, so I work at the Centre for Climate Engagement based in the University of Cambridge, so calling in from a grey morning in the UK. And I'll be speaking about just a few key insights from our Law and Climate Atlas project, which are related to trade. And so this project was mapping intersections between climate change and many different areas of law. So you can see a really basic diagram just of how we can conceptualize the link between trade, climate, and law, going from the broader context, so just the social and environmental changes coming about as a result of climate change, which of course through new markets, new technologies, new industries, impact trade patterns, and even when there isn't a direct legal intervention, there's certainly trade legal implications. One layer up is where I'll focus. So this is what are called intersecting legal regimes. So laws which might not directly reference trade at all, or possibly even climate, but which do have an impact on trade and climate issues. And our argument is that trade professionals, trade lawyers, and others should certainly understand and navigate these issues, but also possibly consider how these other legal regimes could be influenced to advance sustainable trade goals. And these can be sort of enabling of sustainable trade, but they can also potentially be obstructive to a sustainable trade system. Going up, I sort of won't focus on these, but obviously you also have the climate implications of existing and long-standing trade law, and then the sort of most targeted interventions we see would be specific new climate rules in trade agreements and other really specific interventions. So I'm going to go over just a few quick examples of some of these intersecting legal regimes we found. And this is sort of drawing on the UK and US, which are the jurisdictions we've looked at so far in the Atlas, but these might apply to other jurisdictions. And certainly we hope to expand to cover a more diverse range of countries. So looking at big picture sort of domestic climate policy, one example we see in many different countries is carbon pricing. And in a UK context, we looked at the UK's emissions trading system and how, with the introduction of a carbon border adjustment mechanism in the EU, this might actually sort of insulate the UK from the effects of the CBAM because it has sort of an existing pricing system with fairly high prices. On the sort of other side of the big picture climate policies, we see subsidies and investment, of course, to some extent going to be important in almost every jurisdiction to tackle climate change. But here we see potentially some more issues with trade or barriers with trade it can create. And one sort of obvious example is the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. This is, really big step for US climate policy, but it also has in it things like rules of origin requirements in sort of electric vehicle tax credits. And so there are some sort of trade law issues created there. Of course, we also have corporate law, and Alessandra sort of went over some of the key intersections there. But I think, yeah, important to note that domestic corporate legal requirements are changing, at least making companies look harder at where they're sourcing the goods from, what sort of goods they're sourcing, and this could have an impact on trade patterns. So both through specific due diligence requirements, but also broader disclosure and reporting requirements, which are now not just sort of present in the global north, but really expanding globally. Public law, of course, many intersections there as well, the human rights sort of climate nexus potentially being one of them, but maybe also more sort of novel issues with constitutional arrangements. So we saw that in a UK context again with the sort of policy of ensuring an open border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And that is now also a border between an EU and a non-EU country. And so basically, if the UK doesn't sort of play its cards right with the introduction of a carbon tariff, that could cause issues. But there are many, many other examples of these, for example, obligations under other treaties and also financial law. So that was a very quick run through of just a few of the intersections we've captured, but I think there are some interesting potential next steps here. Looking at practical considerations, is a sort of scope for better collaboration between trade law experts and other lawyers. Of course, closer analysis into multiple jurisdictions, but also conducting the same exercise in reverse. So how do trade climate law issues or climate trade law issues impact other areas of law? So thank you all very much for listening and attending. And of course, do feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
Thank you very much, Nick. And I would like to invite the practitioner on our panel. Andreas Gunst is a partner at DLA Piper and an energy projects and finance practitioner qualified in England and Wales and Ireland. He has both in-house and private practice experience. And his area of focus include energy, financial services, oil and gas, among many others. Andreas, you have the floor.
Thanks very much. And I have actually been working in carbon markets for the last 20 years, almost since the inception of the Kyoto Protocol. And I want to share a couple of key trade issues that we currently see working as a practitioner. And the really four that I want to draw out, some of them have already been touched on. The first one is that the role of environmental attributes and production attributes in international trade is ever growing. We have more interconnectors, we have more cross-border trade in biofuels, biogas, hydrogen, and their derivatives. And all of that makes it necessary in the context clearly of the UNFCCC, the Paris Accord, the nationally determined contributions, but also in fact the trade law requirements to consider the production attributes and the associated emission reductions with that production. The other key point to note for anyone in sort of dealing with those types of transactions is that we're often simplifying the complexity of the different schemes around the certification of those production attributes. And the different concepts, and I will show them very briefly in a moment, but there's book and claim and a mass balance, and sometimes there are combinations for different products, and that's very important to keep separate and to understand. The different temporal and geographical boundaries, which makes the trading and the demonstrating of the environmental attributes very different. There's different commercial rationale, and that's particularly strongly interfacing with some of the issues under the WTO, like subsidy control related measures. But there's also different trades, for instance, for the greenhouse gas protocol, scope 2 or 3 emissions, for fuel quotas, production support schemes, and all of those have different requirements. There is a degree of uncertainty of the treatment of those production attributes under international law. I'll show a quick slide on that. And as I said, policies on EU carbon border adjustment play a role as well. And here the example of a corporate PPA to exempt from the CBAM playing a very important role. I've mentioned very briefly mass balance and book and claim systems. One of the fundamental things that one needs to understand in international trade is that there are different ways in which you can show how a product has been produced and what the intensity of the emissions associated with that production is. And there's also lots of simplification around how you basically show that in a logistics chain. Here, I'm just showing an example of SAF to demonstrate how complex that in fact can be, and how in some instances there is a dual system of those requirements. Environmental attribute certification schemes are in fact broadly speaking similar, and if you come from the carbon markets, you will be able to take across a little bit of the learnings from that for for instance a gold standard or a Vera certification to biofuel or biogas certification under ICC or Red Cert or others, but there are differences. And I think the important thing, again, is to not simplify the process, but to really understand what am I trying to do with that certification scheme, and how does it play out in the actual demonstrating of the production attributes across borders. We have even circumstances where those schemes are, from a mass balance perspective, work across borders. Here is the example of the European Union database that's used for biofuels and green gases, with the combination in effectively an electronic database of what's called the proof of sustainability, so demonstrating what you have produced in the context of the emission reductions and how that production process went, and some guarantees of origin, as they're called in Europe, to demonstrate the legal transfer of the right to those production claims. I don't want to go into too much detail on mutual recognition, but I think the point really is that we are always talking in international trade about mutual recognition, but in fact, most of the trade flows don't require mutual recognition. You have very few trade flows that really would require a mutual acceptance of certification schemes. Electricity, perhaps the noticeable exemption, but even exception, but even there, just worked on basically a cross-border protocol. Singapore, Indonesia for cross-border trades of renewable energy. Again, there, it's not really required to have a mutual recognition, but rather to have an understanding of how the cross-border certification schemes individually in those countries can interact to actually work. I've mentioned very briefly that WTO is very complex in the context of these environmental attributes. We've done a study for the Hydrogen Council about a year ago on the question of how do you actually track environmental attributes, and how do you deal with those under the different WTO agreements. GATT has already been mentioned. The TBT and the SCM regimes also very important in the context of demonstrating attributes, in particular in hydrogen. And with a limited number, you see the case law there that's been predominantly in the case of biofuels, but providing a little bit of a guidance in terms of how you mutually need to accept and recognize production attributes in that process. Last point, I just briefly want to mention, because it has been raised, CBAM framework as one framework of a trade measure, obviously in the context of climate, to introduce, or rather to level the playing field in relation to national ETS. Here, just as a last point, the possibility in the EU to do a cross-border or sometimes national PPA to exempt from the need to issue CBAM certificates. That's a very, very fast-growing area for us, simply because there's obviously lots of value in doing PPAs to exempt from the European CBAM, also with its own complexities, but as a real example of how trade, climate, a question of grid average emissions, and PPAs actually come together to demonstrate issues in the context of cross-border trade. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andreas. And after that excursion into the domestic and comparative level, we circle back to international trade. And I would like to invite my CISDL colleague, Professor Javiera Cáceres, to give her presentation. She's an instructor professor at the Institute for International Studies at the University of Chile and a PhD research fellow at the International Development Department at the London School of Economics. Javiera, you have the floor.
Thank you, Markus. Good afternoon, Baku. Well, as Markus was saying, I'm based in London, but I'm actually from Chile, so that's where you're going to get my perspective from. So first, as part of my intervention, I want to refer to the main results of my latest research. So I want to focus first on high climate ambition commitments for NDC consecution in existing EU trade relations with Chile and the Andean community, and also on the inclusion of forestry-related provisions in the EU and EU Andes, meaning the EU and Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru agreements, which is part of the article that I co-authored with Dr. Gili Pacheco. So first, looking at NDCs in Latin American countries, these countries have identified measures concerning mitigation and adaptation focusing on non-greenhouse gases in various sectors, including water, energy, forestry, and agriculture. Moreover, they have identified implementation challenges and the need for cooperation to achieve these objectives. In this context, as Brendan was mentioning, bilateral trade agreements become actually of the utmost importance as they frame the bilateral economic relation and also serve as an instrument for cooperation activities. When considering the inclusion of an environmental perspective in trade relations, it is relevant to focus first on the text of the agreements and also on post-treaty actions. So both will shape how countries respond to the climate emergency. Regarding the relations between the EU with Chile and the Andean community, parties have actually resorted to agreements and post-treaty actions to enhance the sustainability of their trade and investment relation. So in the case of Chile, Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, they have recognized their indispensable role in meeting global climate targets as articulated in their NDC. The existing bilateral trade agreements with the EU cover some of the elements included in their NDCs. Hence, we can identify provisions that are not directly linked to, but also referred to, for instance, market approaches to deforestation, energy, mining, sustainable agriculture, increased forest plantations, increased technology transfer, cooperation in circular economy, sustainable management of fisheries, cooperation in biodiversity conservation, among others. So most of these provisions are encompassed in the trade and sustainable development chapters of the agreements. Therefore, they can also maybe further develop and reinforce through treaty amendments, post-treaty actions, and enhance cooperation activities. Looking into a specific sector of particular sensitivity for bilateral relation, I want to refer to the forestry sector. So first, forest and deforestation provisions within the EU, Chile, and EU Andean countries are part of a broader sustainable development or environmental commitments in these specific chapters. The primary purpose of articles referring to the sector on specific forestry-related commitments is to promote sustainable forest management and trade on those derived from it, while also discouraging these illicit practices. So for this purpose, in these agreements, we find references to CITES, for example, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, regarding timber species or the development of mechanisms to promote the traceability of timber products, their certification, transparency, management, forest resources, and also control mechanisms are included. Also, members of the agreements may resort to general exceptions to implement policies to preserve their environment. These clauses are standard to most trade agreements, either multilateral, regional, or preferential, but they will allow parties to deviate from their obligation to safeguard the environment, generally under the assumption that this deviation is not an undercover trade protection and is not applied in any discriminatory means concerning other countries or economies. As for post-treaty actions, Committee's discussions, EU, Chile, and EU Andes agreements have led to joint declarations supporting sustainable development and environmental goals. So post-treaty actions such as the joint decisions on sustainable development have primarily involved cooperation and information exchange between the parties. These committees enable parties to share experiences, coordinate bilateral agendas, and establish regional and multilateral positions, guiding future negotiations. Just to conclude, just mentioned that the commitments included in the text of the agreements and post-treaty actions developed by the parties may foster the sustainability of trade and investment agreements. And the examples of how forestry sector has been treated in the EU-Latin American relations shows that if parties agree to work on sustainable relations, but also fulfill their implementation goals accordingly, these instruments will enhance this objective. So thank you, Markus. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you very much, Javiera, and thank you in particular for reminding us that where trade treaties exist, we can use the instruments in the trade treaty to further enhance the climate change, biodiversity, sustainable development nexus with trade. Our last but not least speaker is our very good colleague, Mario Tokas, who is a lawyer based in Geneva. He's the program manager for the Trade, Investment, and Finance program at the Center for International Sustainable Development Law, and currently a graduate researcher at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. Marius, you have the floor.
Thanks, Markus. Good morning, everyone. Actually, today I'm based in Chicago, Illinois, so it is almost as if to say good night to everyone. But allow me a little bit to conclude the discussion today, focusing again back on international investment law, and mostly to corroborate what has already been said by my fellow panelists. So try to make a few comments, mostly on investment promotion, which is an aspect that we haven't really seen so much when we discuss about investment, but with a few tweaks and a few comments on investment protection. So far, general international investment treaty practice, we see paradox. On the one hand, we see states considering, even sometimes even academics or civil society, considering investment as very separate from trade, as if financial flows are very different from flows on trade in goods or trade in services. And at the same time, we see a tendency to incorporate elements of developments that we have seen in the trade field within international investment treaties. For me, and actually from the research that we're doing at the center, I think we should abandon this idea. And what we saw recently from climate litigation in very different fora is that at the end, financial flows, trade flows are part of the same supply mix of production and consumption patterns that the state has, and both of them affect how ambitious or not a state can be. And what we have seen as very ambitious legal innovations in the field of international economic law have been mainly on investment promotion, investment liberalization, some investment regulation, investment facilitation, which are very critical when we discuss promoting sustainable green financial flows. So as a negative example, yesterday, a few departments in the ministries of India clearly said that the team that negotiates the investment deals and the team that negotiates the trade deals should be completely separate, and we don't want to mix them up. But as you realize, this creates some issues, because on the one hand, you may want to promote green investments through trade in services, but at the same time, you want to promote differently or how to treat differently how existing investments are protected. And at the end, when we talk about trade in services, if we go back to the modes of supply, one specific part of this is foreign investment. So to go to a few positive examples, we have seen recently examples of investment treaties that introduce positive commitments of states, especially developed states, to provide financing or identify private financing projects for critical infrastructure that is very important for the green transition. We saw this in the EU-Kenya Economic Partnership Agreement. Similarly, in the EFTA-India trade and economic agreement, we saw commitments on behalf of the EFTA states to promote investment, quality investment, as it has been said by India, and this commitment can actually be enforced through trade sanctions on behalf of India. Further, we have seen, especially in some intra-Africa agreements, enforceable sustainability standards being introduced as investor obligations. Those standards may be more general, what we see in the field of business and human rights, but also more specific that are related to specific ISO standards on mining or environmental operation. And lastly, we have seen agreements that introduce positive environmental commitments for states. And sadly, with the recent election cycles, we have seen that we cannot presume that states that are now climate ambitious will remain climate ambitious. And since investment litigation has been seen or has been identified as a major threat to a state, maybe we could use it as a positive way to ensure that ambition remains. So on investment protection, as a final comment, because general exceptions have been previously discussed, I think that we should never forget about the context, that investment protection standards have been developed in a situation where general exceptions do not occur. Rather, investment exceptions, general exceptions exists in trade where the positive commitments of states did not provide any policy or positive regulatory space for states. So we have seen that investment standards have been interpreted by tribunals, sometimes even more broad than general exceptions. If someone could make a distinction between the necessity analysis under Article 20 of the GATT and how non-discrimination has been interpreted by investment tribunals, you would see that probably there is a broader policy space in the investment protection standards than in the general exceptions. So we should incorporate we should examine the issue holistically as part of a general investment and trade promotion. But on the other hand, purely for investment protection, we should not transpose standards that were very differently developed in a very different normative setting, which could create more problems than actually solving ones. And precisely the Eco Oro is one such example. So that concludes a bit what I had the time to present today, and looking forward to the engagement. And thank you very much again.
Thank you very much, Marius. And that leaves us not a lot, but a little bit of time for discussions and questions. I saw our very active audience has already posed some questions, and it would be wonderful if Fatima could not just introduce herself, but also maybe first field some of the questions on trade, and then in the second round, we circle back to investment. So, Fatima,
yes.
What are the questions?
My name is Fatima. I am a student from Azerbaijan, Baku, from ADA University, and I will pose several questions. Firstly, Rustam Mirzalizadeh from Azerbaijan Energy Regulator Agency asks, what resources and partnerships do we need to effectively navigate these legal complexities and ensure our climate actions are legally sound and sustainable? Should I ask?
Fantastic. If you summarize a few questions, we can take them all together.
This one was separate question. The other ones I will link them together.
Okay, yeah. Then we just go back to some of our presenters. If I could maybe ask Janssen, who has worked in the energy space, and then Andreas, where to find resources to make sure these kind of operations are fully legally compliant. Janssen, do you want to highlight some resources you find useful?
Thanks very much, Markus, and thanks to Fatima for highlighting that question, which had caught my eye as well. And on the investment side, notwithstanding everything I've said about perhaps the need to amend treaties and change arbitral approaches, the fact of the matter is that states are living in the world as it is today. And that brings me to how do states navigate their obligations as they currently exist? And at the moment, I think on the investment side, there really isn't a comprehensive toolkit for states to use when considering regulatory changes, when considering making policies that are going to have effects on investors, but nevertheless are necessary in order for them to pursue their climate goals. So this allows me the opportunity to highlight a new project that we're starting with the Asian Development Bank to prepare precisely such a toolkit. Very similar to work that we did with APEC a few years back on general management of investment treaty obligations. But this would be a toolkit designed to guide non-lawyer policy officials who have to deal with these issues and be aware of them, and to help them better structure and implement policies in a way that's, let's say, mitigates the risk of potentially ending up on the sharp end of an investment treaty claim. So that's basically my point is watch this space, and there will be materials available within the next 12 months, we hope.
Fantastic. And Andreas,
Yeah.
you talked about hydrogen as a transition fuel, and I wonder what you recommend, which kind of resources you recommend to your clients.
Yeah, I think there's two things to recognize. I entirely agree with the statement. It isn't just made on the point of you need to educate people, because there is quite a lot out there. There's quite a complex interaction between international trade law, national measures. There's also, unfortunately, sort of a long-standing case law on things like, production-related attributes and claims. It goes back to the shrimp cases, for instance, and they don't quite fit the things that we're looking at currently in terms of things like hydrogen. So trying to educate. I really do see a great role here, in particular also for academia, to take that, bring it together, understand the interrelations, and to basically show a way in terms of how do you link that all together in a way that could fit. That's one thing. The other thing, obviously, is in the context of the transactional world. It is just very important that you do rely in certain instances on some additional, rather than trying to make things fit that is already there, which is obviously important, very often works. Also very often the need for particular projects to come up with specific frameworks, to look at it at a slightly more granular level. And we've seen that certainly for hydrogen transactions. We've seen it, I've mentioned the cross-border power transactions, Indonesia, Singapore, trying to work basically bottom up rather than top down with the international frameworks, bottom up with bilateral frameworks is, I think, very important to come to a point of making these transactions work and having the necessary resources. But it's a combination of law and training and resources, and that initiative that Janssen just mentioned is very laudable in that context, because it will certainly help.
Fantastic. And with that, we go back to the many questions we had. Fatima, do you have a summary of some of the questions?
Yeah.
Perhaps more trade related, and then investment in the second row.
I have several questions on the topic of investment, and one of them is, like, I sum up the questions. The question is, how can we balance foreign investment protection with the state's right to regulate for climate goals without compromising essential climate actions?
Then we go, perhaps we start with Marius and then go to Janssen, because they've published and worked And I strongly recommend to the audience to look up their work that is published in this particular question. Marius.
Thank you, Markus. So for
Can
me,
you
maybe, and
balance?
Jansen, you may disagree with me on this, but for me, you shouldn't actually balance this with a general exception. For me, to the contrary, you have to be on the positive side, introduce positive obligations of states, and we have seen provision that clearly state that when a state introduces a measure which is as a way to comply with its international climate change obligation or as a way to enforce an NDC or incorporate an NDC into action, then this should not be considered as a breach of an investment obligation. So instead of relying into some general exceptions, which again can be very variably be interpreted by investment tribunals, we should very clearly on the opposite either exclude from the jurisdiction of a possible investment tribunal measures that are precise implementation of an NDC or a precise implementation of a climate change commitment, or we should clearly provide that states do have the right to introduce measures that are necessary to implement the XYZ climate change obligation.
Jansen.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, I don't know that I disagree with that necessarily at all. I think the difficulty for states is that it's a very complex, fragmented regime. And we have 2,600 bilateral investment treaties and hundreds of FTAs with investment chapters. So achieving a kind of harmonization of approaches with respect to climate change measures is exceptionally difficult. And the work that OECD is doing to either create model clauses that states could adopt through a multilateral convention and replace existing FET provisions, et cetera, or to come up with some multilateral instrument on a joint interpretation. I mean, these are efforts. Whether they will be successful, I'm not quite sure, in light of the comments that Marius has rightly made. I mean, there are ways of addressing these things if one is writing tabula rasa, and maybe the African Free Trade, Continental Free Trade Investment Protocol gives a way forward. But we're not writing on tabula rasa. That's the difficulty. So I don't mean to be discouraging, but it is a tough row to hoe.
And I think, Jansen, you also highlighted that investment law doesn't just protect old industries and fossil fuel production. It also can be used by new industries, maybe more adventurous projects to produce renewable energy and provide stability for those. I know Andreas wants to come in as well. Andreas, please come in, and then we will definitely have a trade question.
well, it kind of combines the two almost. Just very briefly, I think it's important to perhaps differentiate between a few cases. So we certainly, if I look back at sort of what we had over the last decade or so, we had cases where investors have come in, implemented projects, and then states have become more ambitious throughout the implementation of the project, and suddenly the project became, quote unquote, stranded because the climate goals have changed. And I think that's sort of one category which has a slightly different response to other examples that we had where states were ambitious, perhaps too ambitious. And I refer in particular to the ones that we had in Southeast Europe, where they implemented renewable energy support schemes. Then all of the investors flooded in. The production costs became very quickly a lot lower, in particular on solar, but also on wind. And then the state decided, well, hang on, this is too much. I can't, I can't build that into my current socialization of the costs of that support scheme. And so it's not been a matter of interests not being aligned. The state had an interest to have more renewable sources. The investors had an interest of doing that, but it was kind of the way the costs had developed around the scheme that were then unbearable. So I think keeping those issues separate and understanding the right response. In some cases, interests are aligned with the states. In some cases, interests are perhaps not or less so aligned because of a transition issue is important, because I think they do have different dynamics, also different responses in terms of the way in which investment protection applies and supports the investment that was made in that particular context. But I think the key is to make it very clear that you do understand the NDCs, you do understand the policies, you have an understanding of the projection of the costs coming down and where the market goes, and then to build that into it, because then issues will only really come to bear where it's a real problem that investor-state arbitration can successfully address.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much. And we have a wonderful question on trade. Fatima, go ahead.
Yes. Justin from Uganda asks, what is the legal framework under which the World Trade Organization oversees climate resilient trade and investment at national level?
Fantastic. And there's another question from Sharafadin, integrating NDCs with trade policies. How can countries align their trade and investment policies more effectively with the NDC to meet their climate targets? Are there specific examples? So with those two questions, we go back to the original order, perhaps, and start with Alessandra and then go to Brent.
Yes, perfect. Great question. Great questions, actually. Thank you, Markus. So I wanted to take this opportunity to call your attention to a resource that we have developed at the CISDL a couple of years back, where we actually analyzed trade profiles of Mercosur countries in the context of the EU negotiations of the EU Mercosur FTA. And we realized there's a general disconnect between countries' trade profiles and the ambitions stated in their NDCs. So I think, considering that we are up for a new updated round of NDCs at COP30 in my home country of Brazil, what I would like to say about this is we need to be intentional in weaving in trade into the design, the design process of NDCs, and so as to overcome this disconnect. I was also a member of the B20 Task and Investment, Trade and Investment Task Force in the context of G20 Brazil. And this is also a recommendation that we have made in the context of the task force. I'm not sure I have any success examples, unfortunately, but I do think that these two things need to go hand in hand a lot more than they have.
Yes, and Brendan.
Thanks, Markus. I think it's a really good question. I think the point is to try to make the connection more explicit in the NDCs and bringing trade and trade policy more directly in there, because most of the framing is always indirect. It has broader policy objectives. So you could, for example, encourage electric and hybrid vehicles, and that would lead to the import of more energy efficient vehicles and electric appliances and things like that, if it's a broader one. So in the work that you've done for us at the Commonwealth Secretariat, and the study that I will highly recommend once it concludes, you've tried to look at some model NDCs to better incorporate trade, and it's usually making a more direct causal relationship, for example, by bringing in words like reducing high-emitting inputs in certain sectors, fostering the importation of inputs related to this industry, electrifying sectors, leveraging trade agreements and the provisions of trade agreements around capacity building, access to finance. So I think the answer is, in short, is to be more explicit and very clear about how you see trade contributing to those climate ambitions. Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic. And Javiera, do you want to come in as well?
Thank you, Markus. I think I want to focus on how developing countries would actually implement this, even if they're more direct, or how they will implement these provisions concerning trade and NDCs. I think it's very important to consider how many developing countries will need support in terms of cooperation agreements and funding to move forward these provisions and actually make a change concerning how they bring forward NDCs and these trade agreements. I think it's also very important how many developing countries will still rely heavily on fossil fuels for energy and exports. So making a specific transition challenging without significant economic restructuring is something that we should take into consideration. Also, like as I mentioned, the term of like transition into these greener technologies could be expensive. So not developing countries have the capacity to immediately adopt such measures. So it will be important, once again, these cooperation agreements, but at the same time, being able to modify these agreements through the post-treaty committees that I've discussed during my presentation. I think that will be like sort of like what I'm focusing on from the developing countries perspective.
Yes, and we have Professor Marie-Claire Coligny-Seger on the line, who thought extensively about the intersection of trade and sustainable development. Marie-Claire, do you want to share some final thoughts? Also, how perhaps the multilateral level could make use of this new cooperation that started here in Baku on trade, investment and finance and climate change nexus?
I think I will defer to the experts in this panel who have given such excellent answers to these questions in so many different contexts. I've deeply enjoyed hearing from you, and simply add that I think that there are both substantive and procedural steps that need to be taken next. As you know, I'm a great believer in treaty law and actual trade and investment agreements that are tailored to the existing trade and investment relationships between the countries. And so looking at impact or potential impact of a treaty before you finalize it, and then developing the ways to ensure that it will enhance, foster as much as possible the areas in which we want to be able to develop new renewable energy investment, new nature-based solutions investment, new or scaled up areas of mitigation, adaptation, resilience, or even carbon markets, tailoring the trade agreement in the law to be able to achieve that, not just through cooperation chapters, not just through exceptions for conflicting or overlapping agreements, but actually enhancing trade and investment in the areas that we've identified in the Paris Agreement to be crucial for carbon markets to be able to thrive. I think that is still one of the most important things to do first. But I also can see some incredibly exciting work that is going on worldwide in terms of new types of treaties, everything from the Indigenous Peoples Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement that has been formed between different indigenous nations across Asia Pacific, to the agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability, and some provisions there on fossil fuel subsidy reform. So I think this is an important area to watch. You're in an incredibly important space at the moment. In a book that we did with Oxford University Press just a couple of years ago, we lay out an agenda. It's called Athena's Treaties, because when we looked at it, we discovered that the ancient Greek god of trade, actually Hermes, was also the Greek god of thieves. And so we wanted to reconsider how a trade and investment agreement might look if it was written for Athena, who might be your sustainable development goddess. And what we actually tried to look at was, what kind of provisions could you include in these binding treaties between parties, tailored to their own existing economic relationship, that would take you forward and achieve your sustainable development goals. And this is where I think some of the most exciting work is being done. The point I would close on in response to this, and it's something that I think has been underlying the incredibly rich and substantive exchange of experts here, is that especially for highly climate vulnerable countries, but also for countries like mine in Canada that looks south to our neighbors every 4 years and sort of throws our hands up as they go through their political process. I think during troubled times, especially, trying to put our agreements, put our minds together from the trade and the environment and the social human rights, anti-poverty communities, The one thing about somebody who thinks you're all a bad idea is that you learn to work together. And I do think that that's important
in this
to go.
fantastic spirit of working together, I'd like to thank our sponsors. I'd like to thank our partners, especially the Commonwealth Secretariat and DLA Piper, and I'd hand over to Matthäus to close us.
Thank you very much, everyone. Pleasure hearing the discussion, everyone on board. If we are almost exactly on time, so congratulations to this panel. Congratulations to all the panelists and discussants. We thank everyone's discussion and chats and questions, and we hereby close the session. Thank you very much, everyone.